Hey guys, Paul Davecchio. I'm just going to walk through the way I process Canon 7D footage. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's only for Canon footage or Canon DSLR footage, but it's also for footage that has a lot of built-in contrast to it. Some Sony footage is like that, if there's no log or anything like that. Here I have part of a timeline for my web series Aftermath, and I'm just going to concentrate on this shot because I feel like most of the other shots are shots that I want to match to this shot. Now, I'm going to find a nice place to grade, and I think that's probably good, so I'm just going to add a little marker here so I can jump back to that since it's not at the beginning. Now here I have a denoise and sharpen. What I can do with that is either right click and add correction, and that'll add that, or I can, let's say I started a grade and that's my beautiful grade. Let's say you have a bunch of different things in here. This grade is just getting more beautiful as it goes on, and yeah, there we go. That's like a toxic kind of look. So let's say I have this and I wanted to add my denoise, and if I just do append, obviously it's going to put it on the end. It's not where I want it. You want to denoise before you do any corrections. Add correction is going to overwrite it. Don't want that. Display node graph obviously is not really going to do anything for me. One of the things you can do is if you start grading and you realize that you haven't denoised it, you could just drag it and drop it right in the beginning, and there you go. So we're done. Now, what we're going to do is reset this garbage and get into the real grading here. So one of the things actually before I start, if you want to create this quick way of adding a denoiser, I can just set this up, and I have a very long verbose tutorial on how to do that, and I'm not going to get into that, but make sure there are no other nodes in here that have any other corrections, because if there are, like this one, and you save it, this is the one that I just created, it's actually going to save that in here with it. So if I add the correction, that's in there. So you want to delete that. All I have to do is hit Command Option G. It'll take a still, and just to stay organized, put it in a power grade library instead of the stills, because this will get crazy. So put it in a power grade, and then you can click down here and you can just rename it denoise and sharpen. And now you have access to it very quickly. You just add it and then start your grade. Right off the bat, Canon 7D footage, even with the flat profiles, they kind of have a little bit too much contrast to my taste if you just do the Pro Loss setting or anything like that. I still feel like it has a little bit too much contrast, so I like to actually look at my waveform here and set my black level to just kind of kissing black. So that's about right. And my next node, do a reverse S-curve so I can kind of dig into the shadows here a little bit more. So it's actually decreasing the amount of contrast. Now, of course, your colors are going to get less saturated, but that's okay. And you can see that this is becoming less contrasty. So I like to start here. That's good enough for what we're doing. You'll have to kind of judge based on your image. And I like that. So what I'm going to do now is pump up the saturation a little bit, because I feel that decontrasting it desaturated it as well. So I just want to kind of come in here and make sure I have a good amount of saturation to start. Now, you don't want to go too far because you're going to add a contrast curve, and when you add a contrast curve, obviously your colors get more saturated. So you just want to make sure that you bring in enough color, but not so that it looks like the final grade. Now, this is a good starting point. Let's say I want to add a little more yellow-red in order to make this sort of like a contaminated, gritty, dirty kind of feel, because this is a horror action film. So I'll just push this, and I'll just use my control surface so that I can kind of get this dialed in a little bit nicer. And I'm just adjusting the gamma here. So around there, you don't want to go too far because, again, you're going to saturate it with your contrast curve. So I think that's good. Might be a little bit too much, so I'll bring it a little bit back. And that's about where I want it. Let's talk about contrast curves for a second. So this is a way to take away contrast. Now you might ask, why can't I just use this? Well, this is going to lock your black level to 0, right? Because we pushed the black level here to 0, so it just kisses 0, and then the node after that, when I start adjusting it, you start to see it basically right there, it kind of locks to 0, unless you do something extreme and stupid like that. So let's just go back to our reverse S-curve here. If I use the slider, you can kind of see that it actually lifts the black level. That's not what I want at all. I do the same thing with adding an S-curve. I'd like to add my own S-curve and not the one that is kind of baked into the look of the Canon 7D. And I don't like using this because a slider doesn't really give you as precise controls. If you just need more contrast in general, then it's a good thing. But I like to be more precise and really kind of dig in there and push these points around so I can see where it's looking best. If you just do a generic S-curve, you start to see that your midtones have jumped way down. I usually don't bring it out this far. I'm usually around here, the halfway point between here and here. So I just kind of take this and push it down to where I think it looks good. Depending on the gamma, if it's too high, I might push it over this way more to bring down the gamma. But for this actual shot, I kind of want to affect more of the shadows here. So I think there is good. And I'll just push the highlights up a bit. And I'm just going to zoom into the face here so I can check out the highlights on the skin so that they don't go nuts and do that. I want sort of like a smooth highlight roll off. So one of the things I like to do here, instead of adding just 2 points up at the top of the highlight curve, I kind of like to add another one. And you can kind of see what that does if you watch the scopes. But let me just kind of bring that in there, and you can kind of see it creates a smoother transition into the highlights. Now, what does that do? Yes, it creates a smoother transition into the highlights, but how is it doing that? And I think it's important to understand this, that when you add this second point, you can actually kind of see here, if you watch the uppermost part of the waveform, that if I push this around, you see if I don't have it, the highlights are a little bit more compressed. And when I do have it in here, it kind of holds the position of the highlights, but as I move it up, you start to see that the highlights stretch a little bit more. In order to point this out, I'm just going to move this point down here so I have a little bit more room. Now, without it, now watch what happens when I add it and push it. See how that stretches just the upper part? It kind of stretches the highlights. So it kind of creates more of a gradual gradation into the highlights, which I like. And so you kind of just have to look at the footage and go, okay, well, where does it look good? But you could also look at the curve and just make sure that it's a smooth transition. You just want to adjust it and stretch those highlights as much as you can. You get a little bit more detail out of the highlights that way. It gives it a more filmic kind of look. So I have a pretty nice roll off into the highlights there. I'm pretty happy with that. But actually, I'm going to do it more in the uppermost part. I usually don't like to push the highlight point out that far. I think maybe around, let's say around there. And smooth that out a little bit. It's looking good. You could also do the same for the shadows if you want. I don't really see it too necessary, but let's do it just for the hell of it. All right, that's good. I kind of like that look. And the reason why I like to set my colors up and saturation and everything before the contrast curve is the contrast curve is actually going to punch up those colors. So I don't really like to add the contrast and then create a node after that and push the colors. I just kind of don't like that. I feel like it sort of kind of contaminates the image a little bit more. Now, if I'm doing a special kind of look, I might do that. But generally speaking, I usually like to adjust the colors before and then add the contrast curve, and that kind of punches up the colors more. And then after that, I can kind of go back in there if I really wanted to and desaturate based off of what the colors now look like after the contrast curve. One more node, and I like to come in with my Open Effects and bring in my film convert. That's a separate plugin. One of the things I don't really like is the film color. It does sort of remap the colors. So you see the greens aren't as green. They kind of move more toward yellow. That depends on the look you're going for, but usually what I do is I turn this down, or I might even just let a little bit of that bleed through. But for the sake of the tutorial, let's turn these off and keep the grain at 100. For Canon 7D footage and Canon DSLR footage, I really like to keep the grain at 100, especially for this project. I think it adds a lot of texture and kind of grittiness and dirtiness. So I will keep that at 100, but if you want less grain, I usually find a good place to start is around 60. What that'll do is give it texture without giving it too much grain. One of the things that you don't want to do is grade by numbers. So you don't want it to line up exactly on this line if it's not looking right. You know, you don't want to go, oh, well, the numbers are right, so I'll just leave it there. You don't want to do that. And make sure you're grading off a calibrated monitor. If it looks good, it looks right, then it is right. You don't have to worry about the numbers. The numbers are there to get you in the ballpark, and then you have to leave it up to your instinct and your developed eye and skill to adjust accordingly so that the skin tones and everything else in the image looks nice. And again, here with the Parade, you can kind of see that the blue channel is clipped, but that's okay because I like the look. Again, do not grade by numbers. Grade by creativity and the final look. Again, this is Paul Del Vecchio. Hit me up through Twitter at PaulDV or on Instagram at PDelV or Facebook.com/PaulDV. If you like this video, subscribe. More coming soon. Thanks again, Paul Del Vecchio, Triple E Productions. I'll talk to you guys later.